I want to begin and actually go on for a while in a way that may well seem to you very remote from anything that you expected me to talk about. Whatever you might have expected me to talk about, this is likely to be remote from it. I hope before I'm done it won't seem so remote, though, of course, in the nature of the case, only you can be the judge of that. But I think it has its intriguing aspects. I want to start by saying something about a man named Henry Sidgwick. Sidgwick, though very little known today outside professional philosophy circles, was one of the most important and influential British moral philosophers in the last half of the 19th century. His book, The Methods of Ethics, on which he labored for years and which went through 7 different editions, always carefully and thoroughly revised by Sidgwick, and that was in an era long before you had computers to do that kind of revision. His book is still today a sort of a classic in the tradition of utilitarian thought, even though it's a work, as I say, that really only professional philosophers read. Sidgwick was the son of a clergyman, but as a young man he experienced a crisis of faith and really lost his faith. He remained sort of wistfully eager to believe, but unable really to do so, to the degree that John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, is supposed to have said of him that Sidgwick never did anything but wonder whether Christianity was true and prove it wasn't and hope that it was. But now here's the thing about Sidgwick that's of interest for my purposes today. How is it that Henry Sidgwick, as meticulous, cautious, and to be honest, dry as dust philosopher as you're ever going to read, how is it that he should have spent many of his adult years investigating the claims of parapsychology, things like seances, for instance? He was a founder and first president of the Society for Psychical Research that was formed in 1882, though Sidgwick had actually been working on this stuff well before the formation of the society. Now, it's true that Sidgwick was not alone in this. There was clearly something in the late Victorian era that encouraged these sorts of interests, since among his associates in this endeavor were William Gladstone, a longtime prime minister in England, Alfred Lord Tennyson, the famous poet, and Lewis Carroll, all also involved in the Society for Psychical Research, all of them engaged in what Sidgwick's biographer Bart Schultz calls an endeavor to re-enchant the universe. Sidgwick's friend Frederick Myers recalled a conversation the two of them had in 1869, which gives a little of the flavor of this endeavor to re-enchant the world. As Myers wrote, "In a starlit walk, which I shall not forget, I asked him almost with trembling whether he thought that when tradition, intuition, metaphysic had failed to solve the riddle of the universe, there was still a chance that from any actual observable phenomena, ghosts, spirits, whatsoever there might be, some valid knowledge might be drawn as to a world unseen. Already, it seemed, he had thought that this was possible. Steadily, though in no sanguine fashion, he indicated some last grounds of hope, and from that night onwards, I resolved to pursue this quest, if it might be, at his side." And so the sober philosopher found himself consulting with mediums at seances, interviewing Madame Blavatsky on one occasion. He engaged in careful study of telepathy, transferring information from one person to another without using any of our usual sensory channels. He had a very deep interest in reports of ghosts and haunted houses, and although he died without ever finding the kind of proof that he really was looking for, and these people took engaged in enormously careful studies in search of this proof, Sidgwick never really gave up hope of this in his life. Now, why? Why was he so committed to this research? The simple answer, though of course Sidgwick was by no means a simple, uncomplicated man, is that he was desperate to find evidence of an afterlife. And that desperation was intimately related to his work in moral theory, to his fear that virtue might go unrewarded, that there might be no joy to be found in being virtuous. And although Sidgwick's theory is more complex than I can examine here, or probably anywhere, or than you want me to examine, it will be enough simply to notice where his desire to defend utilitarianism led him. Utilitarians think that when we act, we're aiming to produce happiness, which they think should be the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But of course, I might pursue happiness a bit differently. That is, I might aim at my happiness, which may not be the same as the general happiness. And so Sidgwick found himself faced with two forms of hedonism, which he called egoistic and universalistic. The universal form of hedonism was utilitarianism, which Sidgwick wanted to defend, if he could. But he had to acknowledge that it might not be irrational for me to pursue my own happiness rather than the general happiness, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The question was, what argument, if any, could practical reason give to make it clear that my aim ought to be universal rather than egoistic? And alas, Sidgwick thought perhaps reason could find no argument that was rationally compelling. And this is the central problem that runs through Sidgwick's methods of ethics. It's what he called the dualism of practical reason. Practical reason just seems to speak with two voices. On the one hand, Sidgwick argues at length that it is reasonable for us to seek the happiness of the larger whole, the greatest good, the universe of sentient beings, as he likes to say. But on the other hand, it is also reasonable for us to act in whatever way is most conducive to our own happiness. And if we're honest, we'll have to admit he thinks that those two aims cannot always be reconciled. We cannot plausibly say that your good consists entirely in promoting the greatest good for others. Sometimes the two may just seem to conflict and to stand in tension. So the path of duty or virtue may seem ultimately at odds with one's own interest or well-being. The virtuous life may be the right path for us to take, even if it's painful to follow. But that's a little different from calling such a life a good life. You see, a life in which one really takes joy and flourishes. And so the very famous, really infamous concluding paragraph of the first edition of the Methods of Ethics ends in a kind of confession of failure. Having worked one's way meticulously through 500 pages of really careful philosophy, what the reader is told at the end is that it is ultimately reasonable to seek one's own private good, and it is equally reasonable to seek the good of the whole. Reason teaches both. Reason cannot overcome this dualism. And so the concluding sentence of the first edition read this way: the cosmos of duty is thus really reduced to a chaos, and the prolonged effort of the human intellect to frame a perfect ideal of rational conduct is seen to have been foredoomed to inevitable failure. That's the last word of Sidgwick's magnificent tome: failure. Okay. Now, actually, in future editions, as I say, Sidgwick reworked the thing always very carefully. He altered that last paragraph a little bit. He sort of toned down the pessimism in it just slightly. The last word was no longer failure in it. But he never supposed that he'd found a way to overcome what he called the dualism of practical reason. And that is really why he devoted so much of his energy to the study of the paranormal. Because moral theory needs, at least he thought, moral theory needs some kind of proof of an afterlife. If a life of virtue does not always seem to make the virtuous person happy or joyful, then, God, what's the point of such a life? What sense can we make of it? The cosmos of duty is reduced to chaos, he says. So that, if not God, at least some kind of afterlife is an essential hypothesis in order to see to it that virtue really is ultimately rewarded, that my good or your good is harmonized with the good of all of us. That's what we need. Moral reason contains within itself this potentially explosive contradiction between private and universal good. The teachings of the church, which might at one time have sort of kind of helped us finesse the problem, no longer commanded assent, and certainly they didn't get Sidgwick's assent any longer. In those circumstances, Sidgwick thought a defense of the moral order of the universe, a defense of the claim that the moral life actually made sense, would need would have to come from somewhere else. And so, as I said, the cautious philosopher found himself sitting in the dark at seances, hoping to get messages from people who were already dead, which messages would demonstrate that they had in fact survived death, and that it was therefore not foolish for us to hope for a future life in which order in the cosmos would be restored and chaos forestalled. Now there is, at least for me, a kind of pathos in Sidgwick's life. What bothered him about unbelievers was not their unbelief, which he shared, after all. What bothered him about unbelievers was the fact that they thought they could be happy in a universe without God. See, in a universe that didn't sort of guarantee that virtue really would be rewarded. And if God was not available, morality needed some kind of substitute. And that's what Sidgwick spent his time looking for, though he was honest enough and thorough enough and sort of empirical enough to see that he hadn't found it, and to keep looking right up to the end of his life. Now, I may have belabored Sidgwick's story just a bit, and as I said, you probably didn't expect to get somebody to come and talk about that, though I think it's a fascinating story, actually, and sort of instructive if one's interested in that historical period, a really instructive story, actually. But I don't think it's irrelevant to a talk with the title, of course, which was given to me, which I did not select, The Joy of Virtue, okay? That title probably, I think that title invites us to think of joy, or to try to think of joy as something inherent in, internal to virtuous activity, the joy of virtue, the virtue that is carried along, the joy that's carried along with virtuous behavior. Sidgwick seemed to think, and it doesn't seem entirely wrong to think, of joy as something extra, something which may or may not get added to virtuous activity, may or may not accompany it. And certainly in ordinary everyday conversation, we do distinguish between saying of someone he had a good life, things really just worked out well, it was a happy life, and saying he led a good life, which is a somewhat different sort of statement. And it's even possible that some of those whom we would describe as having led a good life might not, by many of our usual standards, seem to have had a good life, might not have been all that happy at all. So that the morally right and the pleasant do not always seem to coincide. Now this is a very old question. I didn't think it up, Sidgwick didn't think it up, it's been around for a long time. Some of the Greek philosophers, Plato is a good example, did think that morally upright behavior just in itself was good for us, in and of itself. They believed that virtue needs no reward beyond the agent's own sense sort of harmony and fulfillment. Sidgwick did not believe that. Like all Cambridge and Oxford men of his time, he was a well-trained classical scholar. It was just the way the educational system worked. He was in many respects drawn to Greek philosophy, was quite a student of Greek philosophy, but he did not share Plato's view that virtue is just in and of itself good for us, wholly apart from all else. So Sidgwick wrote, for instance, "We may consider whether virtuous life would remain on the whole good for the virtuous agent if we suppose it combined with extreme pain. The affirmative answer to this question, that is to say that the virtuous life would still be good even if combined with extreme pain, was strongly supported in Greek philosophical discussion, but it is a paradox from which a modern thinker would recoil. He would hardly venture to assert that the portion of life spent by a martyr in tortures was in itself desirable, though it might be his duty to suffer the pain with a view to the good of others." That was Sidgwick's take on the question. Now, the question is sort of, what about us? What do we actually think about the possibility of joy in virtue? Can virtue itself, wholly apart from whatever else accompanies it, really in itself bring joy? Or as the way the question's most often been put, I think, in history, is virtue its own reward? Does it need anything else, or is it just its own reward? That's the question that I'm leaving Sidgwick behind now, reluctantly, actually. Leaving Sidgwick behind, I just want to kind of puzzle over that question about virtue being its own reward with you from a couple different angles here. The first thing, just to think about, is to ask yourself, can we imagine what it really would, what would it mean to talk about joy and virtue, about the joy that just sort of accompanies virtue, that's not something external to it that might or may not accompany It's just inherent in it. Well, I think we can picture what we mean here, and I think it's easiest to picture if we think of some examples that aren't especially examples of moral activity. But we have, I think, probably all of us sometimes have experienced a kind of joy that comes from doing something effortlessly, in a way that just fully and completely engages us, and doesn't seem to need anything else. It doesn't seem to need any external reward as an accompaniment, but we're just kind of fully invested and engaged in it. So that, for instance, there is a difference between the way, as a boy, I used to practice the piano painfully and laboriously, and the way a really skilled pianist may sit down and play difficult and demanding music just for the sheer joy. I mean, there's just an enormous difference between those two experiences. There's a difference, to come a little closer to something I cared about when I was a boy. There's a difference between a boy being taught to field the ground ball, being taught all the things he has to do, how to get the glove down, how not to wait and let the ball play you, as we always say, how to smoothly transfer from glove to throwing hand. You know, there's a difference between teaching a boy all those sorts of things and watching Omar Vizquel play shortstop. If you never saw Omar Vizquel play shortstop, the illustration is lost on you, but it's a thing of beauty. Effortless and remarkable. Rudyard Kipling's poem, When Earth's Last Picture is Painted, gives us a kind of rollicking sense of the sheer joy of effortless activity. Here's how the poem goes. When Earth's last picture is painted and the tubes are twisted and dried, when the oldest colors have faded and the youngest critic has died, we shall rest, and faith we shall need it, lie down for an eon or two, till the master of all good workmen shall put us to work anew. And those that were good shall be happy, they shall sit in a golden chair, they shall splash at a 10-league canvas with brushes of comet's hair. They shall find real saints to draw from, Magdalene, Peter, and Paul. They shall work for an age at a sitting and never be tired at all. And only the master shall praise us, and only the master shall blame, and no one shall work for money, and no one shall work for fame. But each for the joy of the working, and each in his separate star shall draw the thing as he sees it for the God of things as they are. You know, this sheer, effortless engagement in the activity. Now, should we think of virtue as activity in that way? As having become sort of so much a part of us, so much a second nature to us, that we do it effortlessly and for the sheer joy of that behavior? Well, maybe in part. It's not uncommon, and I think it's at least partly correct to picture virtues. It's a little more complicated than this, but we can picture virtues as something like skills habitually acquired over time. And if we've really acquired them, then they make us agents who can reliably and dependably act in certain ways with proficiency. It's just become second nature to us. We'll do it with the same kind of ease that Omar Vizquel played shortstop. It's just very important to me, so I have to use it. At the very highest levels of activity, that is what the virtues do, what they're supposed to do. They enable us to live in a truly human way. The philosophers in the last several decades have used the language of flourishing. They enable us to flourish as human beings, to be what a human being is really supposed to be. To live in a manner that brings joy, just through the sheer living of it. The psalmist speaks of one who delights in the law of the Lord. How sweet are thy words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. So I think we can have at least an inkling of what it would mean to really have joy in virtue, have virtuous behavior do that for us. We can make some sense of that. At the same time, though, I think we have to grant that virtuous behavior, at least often, is not just a matter of ease and effortlessness. I've used those words a lot, but that's not always what virtuous behavior feels like. It has also a kind of humbler, less exalted role to play in human life. We need the virtues in part because we're inclined toward vice, because we have all sorts of inclinations that do that. The psalmist who says, lead me in the paths of thy commandments, for I delight in it, also can say, turn my eyes from looking at vanities and give me life in thy ways. So the virtues also serve, and actually maybe more often serve, a kind of corrective function. They help us to control and direct the somewhat wayward impulses that focus our eyes on vanities. They restrain and they discipline us, which is a somewhat different picture from that of effortless activity that we do for the sheer joy of it. So, for example, St. Thomas distinguishes between two forms of the virtue of chastity, both forms of which are somewhat foreign to many students these days, but Thomas distinguishes between what he calls chastity as continence and chastity as temperance. Continence suggests a kind of strenuous control, the restraint and discipline of impulse. And now that's important if your impulses are wayward. It's important to get that form of the virtue. But by contrast, temperance, the virtue at a much higher level as far as Thomas is concerned, he says has the kind of, bears the joyous radiant seal of ease. So it suggests not merely that our contrary inclinations are being controlled, restrained, and disciplined, and ordered, and all those sorts of words, but temperance suggests that we've begun to approach the furthest potentialities of our nature. You see, I mean, where this is really who we are, and we experience a kind of joy in that virtue. Now, both of these, I think, are true in human experience. We have to say both of these things if we want to talk about virtue, so that we can picture a sort of necessary, dutiful, virtuous behavior, and we can picture something that's higher and nobler and, in a sense, more fully human. If by human we mean, more really flourishing as a human being, a kind of unimpeded, joyful activity. Both of these are part of our experience. Now, before we wax, or I wax, too eloquent about the second of these, though, the higher and nobler, the full realization of our nature, I think we need to just honor what I call the lower, the kind of restraint that we experience sometimes in virtue, and we need to be honest about life and ourselves. I do not always, perhaps even, to be honest, not very often, act with the sort of joyous ease and effortlessness that moral virtue at its best exemplifies. More often, I'm afraid, the best I can probably manage is to act from a sense of duty. That's not unimportant, but to act from a sense of duty that in its very nature testifies to the fact that I have some contrary impulses that need to be controlled. So it's a duty that is not quite delight. My best may often be to act with a will that overcomes those contrary inclinations, the good will that Kant thought was the very highest of moral achievements, perhaps because he could not actually bring himself to believe in the possibility of a holy will, which would act with that kind of effortlessness. Now, I don't want to deny that virtue often requires this kind of moral strain, a sort of Prussian dutifulness that does, in its own way, merit our admiration. I mean, it's something to be admired. But if it brings any joy, that joy, I think, will be of the sort of external sort. It's not inherent in the activity itself. It's tacked on as a reward for good behavior. That doesn't make it unimportant for Christians. Quite the contrary. We should give it its due. And I want to try to give it its due, but we have to understand that that's what we're doing. Looking at the life of virtue sort of from the underside, so to speak, C.S. Lewis's Screwtape, that tempter training, junior tempters, Screwtape helps us to appreciate the importance of virtue that does seem to lack any experience of joy, that is just sheer exercise of will. Screwtape writes to Wormwood at one point, we, that is we, denizens of hell, we want cattle who can finally become food. He, the enemy, God, he wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in, he wants to give out. And therefore the two weapons that the enemy, wanting what he wants, cannot use in this battle for the patient's soul are the irresistible and the indisputable. He won't just overpower. Human beings are often inclined to vice, but they cannot simply be compelled to become virtuous, as if virtue were just a matter of rote behavior, apart from the trained will and emotions. And so Screwtape says of the enemy in a wonderful line, he cannot ravish, he can only woo. Now, the path of virtue, therefore, will often have a place for action that doesn't bring much experience of joy. There may be moments, Screwtape says, when the enemy leaves the creature to stand up on its own legs, to carry out from the will alone duties which have lost all relish. Now, of course, that's not everything that fully developed virtue involves. There's no effortlessness or ease or joy there, but it may sometimes be part of the way that leads to joy. And so Screwtape says, "Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys." So we should simply acknowledge that sometimes, and maybe much of the time, the best we can manage is a virtue that will be experienced more as duty than as delight. At the same time, we are, I believe, right to hope for something more. Something that is, as the Church's ancient communion liturgy puts it, I don't know how liturgy folks are, but both duty and delight. It is our duty and delight at all times and in all places to give thanks and praise. What Screwtape describes is not yet joy in virtue itself. It's something important, but it's not joy in virtue. It's not a virtue so deeply ingrained that it's sweeter than honey to our mouths. That's the goal of moral formation. But it's a goal that I think can only finally be a gift of God. Because there are very deep mysteries hidden in the notion of a virtue that carries its own joy along with it, a virtue for which joy is simply internal. Imagine, C.S. Lewis once wrote, a story about someone who had to wear a mask that made her look nicer than she really was. Suppose she had to wear it for years, and when she finally took it off, she realized that her own face had grown to fit the mask. She was now really beautiful, so that what had begun as a disguise had become a reality. Now that's a simple, and in some respects I'm going to suggest too simple, but nevertheless instructive illustration of the development of virtuous character. We tend to become the thing we are pretending to be, or trying to be, or practicing being. At least that's the theory about moral formation that virtue theorists have had. Aristotle says virtue is habit long sustained. Sustain the habit long enough, and gradually it becomes the person whom we are. So the notion is that by habitually doing what is virtuous, just doing it in the sense of external behavior, we will gradually form an inner character that is virtuous. We'll actually become that sort of person, a person who would actually take joy in it. Become a person who acts not just in the teeth of contrary impulses, but who acts because it's become our very nature to do so, because we take a kind of effortless joy in doing it. That's sort of the simple way to think about the inculcation of virtue. But it's a little too simple, actually, because what Aristotle's view is really a little more complicated than that, or than it's often described as being. Becoming a virtuous person is not simply a matter of doing what is virtuous until, as if by sort of magic, Lewis says, let's pretend, until our inner self becomes shaped and formed in the pattern of virtue. That's not quite what Aristotle says. He doesn't say that we can just imitate what a virtuous person does, so that I see you and you're virtuous the way you act, and I try to act the way you do. And that's not unimportant, and that's part of the process, but it's not the whole secret, because to really become virtuous, Aristotle says, I have to do the virtuous deeds in the way the virtuous person does. I don't just do the deed, I do it in the way the virtuous person does it. That is to say, something within us already has to be reformed and reshaped if the training in virtue is to work. If we're to become the sort of person who really can effortlessly and joyfully act virtuously. And that's something else, leaves a kind of gap in Aristotle's theory. See, I can imitate your virtuous activity, but exactly how do I become a person who can do it in the way that you, the virtuous man or woman, does it? There's a kind of gap there, just as there is a gap in the very best efforts of every mother or father to raise children who will habitually and happily do what is right. It's a mystery, and there are no guarantees in that process. There's a gap there that I think the grace of God must finally fill, if it is to be filled at all, with joyful virtue that is sweeter than honey, that is not only duty, but also delight. And we just, to be honest, need to say that. So there's something mysterious and grace-giving about joy in virtue. There is, though, one more aspect of this question that needs our attention. Though when I say there's just one more aspect, you shouldn't think that 60 seconds from now I'll be done. It's going to take a little longer than that. But suppose God does make of us people who at least sometimes take joy in virtue, not just as an external reward tacked on the activity itself. How should we describe that experience? One common way of describing it, I've used it myself so far, is to say that we then experience virtue as its own reward, because we don't need any external thought. It's just its own reward. And putting it that way, saying, we think of virtue as its own reward, is likely to sound rather high-minded and noble. That sounds pretty good. I'm not mercenary in any way. I just want to be virtuous for the sake of virtue. Nevertheless, when we think of it that way, I think we should be just a bit wary. We should be careful or cautious about this language, though it has a long history of its own. We should be careful when we talk about virtue as its own reward. I do not doubt that virtuous deeds may be accompanied sometimes by an inner sense of satisfaction and joy. I think that's right. Something that's not just an external reward, but that is joy in the virtue itself. I've tried to illustrate that a little bit. I don't doubt that an inner joy may be more significant than any kind of external happiness that came as a reward. Nevertheless, to settle for that, to settle for the joy that sort of accompanies virtue, that comes from knowing that we have acted rightly, I think is actually to miss something that is important for Christians. Virtue sometimes does bring with it a certain kind of joy, but no one can live by that joy alone. That is not actually enough. The German philosopher Joseph Pieper put it this way. He wrote, "Does not the moral act truly confer a satisfaction which makes for deeper happiness than any gift that one man can transmit to another?" That is, is not virtue its own reward. No one denies this, but the deepest thirst cannot be allayed in this way. The true expectation of the human heart will not accept such a substitute. Wherever such an attitude has been attempted or asserted, it has been artificial and imposed because it has been something against nature. The Titan's arrogance, which wants nothing as gift, demands in reality not too much, but too little. Now, what does Pieper mean there? Human beings are creatures made for God. That very simple Augustinian premise, that our hearts are restless until they rest in God, captures an essential truth about our nature. And we can state the truth in this way. We are needy beings. We can no more live by virtue alone than by bread alone. And so virtue, with whatever internal joy and rewards it brings along with it, is not really sufficient for genuine human flourishing. And if virtue sometimes requires sacrifice, even if that sacrifice is joyful and effortlessly undertaken, it can be true virtue only if it does not try to protect itself by pretending that there is no loss here, that there's only joy, no cross, no loss, just a virtue that is its own reward. Maybe Henry Sidgwick was not entirely wrong in his drawing back a little bit from that notion. True virtue is a complicated matter. To say that virtue is its own reward, to say that I need no external joy added on, seems to reflect an admirable humility. It's just all I want is to have that virtue. But what is humble about saying that I do not need God to make me happy? Recalling that no one can enter heaven except as a little child, C.S. Lewis once observed that nothing is so obvious in a child, not in a conceited child, but in a good child, as its great and undisguised pleasure in being praised. And we should perhaps not be too taken with our virtue not to want to be praised by God, at any rate. Likewise, we need not only our own effortless virtuosity, but the praise and presence of God that is virtue's proper reward, and in which we can and should delight. So in an effort to be selfless, to think of virtue in itself as just entirely self-sufficient as its own reward, Christians might actually make a mistake. See, we have to be, there's so many, there are far too many ways to go wrong in thinking about this topic. And I want to give you an example of this, an example of such going wrong, of a great Christian thinker close to my own heart and central to my training, Martin Luther. Though I hasten to add, this is early Luther. Okay. In his very early lectures on Romans, Luther, there's a place where Luther strives very strenuously to reject what he calls a covetous love of God. And we understand what he's after, and there's something to it, but consider how he did it. Those who truly love God, Luther says in these lectures, those who truly love God will freely offer themselves to the entire will of God, even to hell and eternal death, if that is what God wills, so that his will may be fully done. Therefore, they seek absolutely nothing for themselves. So evidently, a pure heart that asks nothing for oneself that can give up even the desire for God's presence is reward enough. See, something's gone wrong at that point. When that's what virtue is its own reward means, something's gone wrong. It's become the Titan's arrogance, to use Pieper's language, not effortless joy in virtue. Desire for God is the mark of the creature. And to renounce even that desire is not virtue that most fully realizes our nature, but is the renunciation of our creaturely nature. It's not virtue, it's the primal sin. Now, to be sure, this idea of what was called resignation to damnation was not original with Luther. He had inherited a concern for pure love, as it was called, from elements of the medieval tradition. And if that great mid-20th century Luther scholar Paul Althaus is to be relied upon, Luther never explicitly repeated this in his later writings, so that's good. That's the case. But my point is a simple one. We are needy creatures, even at our most virtuous, even when we live in ways that truly realize and fulfill our God-given nature, even when such virtue carries along with it a kind of inner joy that depends on no external reward. Even then, we are still needy. Even then, joy in virtue cannot be its own reward. It's not all that's needed for life. It can't be the reward that we truly need and desire. And we should not try to cover that lack, even with the joy, the genuine joy, that noble and virtuous activity brings. Instead, we should leave the place open for God to fill in his own good time. This means, I think, that joy in virtue requires most especially the virtue of hope. And hope is something different, of course, from calculation about profit and loss, harm and reward. If hope involves the expectation of a reward that is good for us and will fulfill us, it's still true that that expectation excludes confidence. It's an expectation, but it's not a confidence. For to wait in hope is to know that the joy for which we wait is not at our own disposal. We must hope for it as a gift, not as something that we can acquire through careful planning or upright living or habit long sustained. Hope, therefore, is the clearest mark of our fundamental neediness as creatures. Virtue rightly merits a reward. We can and should hope for it, but that reward is not something at our disposal. One who hopes is, as St. Thomas puts it, a viator, someone who's always en route, always on the way. And a viator, Thomas says, is not a comprehensor. A comprehensor possesses and cannot lose the happiness he desires. His virtue is his own reward, and it's all he needs. A viator, by contrast, is always needy, always on the way toward his desired happiness. So we can hope only for what is not yet a permanent and present condition. We can hope only for a joy that is not fully ours. The glimpses of joy and virtue that we're given, and we are, I think, at least I've tried to stick, we really are given glimpses of joy and virtue that we're given along the way. Those are what we might call grace notes that sustain us. But remembering that they are grace notes should protect us against the presumption that any of us could, here and now, become a comprehensor, someone for whom no reward other than joy in virtue is wanted or needed or desired. For now, along the way, it will always be both our duty and our delight, in whatever mixture we are given, to offer back to God the thanksgiving of a virtuous life, as we are able. but for joy, real, full, lasting joy in virtue. For that, we have to continue to hope. For joy, as C.S. Lewis once put it, is the serious business of heaven. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
I see your teacher standing there, Paul Ramsey, which he did for many years, the same podium. Why is it that it's the book of James, the straw epistle, that has such vibrant joy in it? And then you can refer to Marty Luther on that if you like as well.
Well, Lutherans, of course, are not committed to Luther's personal view of the book of James. You understand that. Though they've sometimes had problems making it cohere with everything in the Pauline writings. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the answer to your question is, but the book of James is sort of single-mindedly focused on virtue in many respects. I mean, that was part of the problem in a way, as far as Luther was concerned. Virtuous behavior is supposed to make us joyful. It's supposed to bring joy. Now, it doesn't always, and I mean, maybe there's a kind of too easy confidence a little bit in James that the two will. I mean, I've tried to bring some ambiguity to that, but we shouldn't talk about virtue only in ways that suggest gritted teeth, contrary inclinations. You know, I mean, I used all that imagery, and that's true. But if that's all it is, it's not a satisfactory discussion of virtue. So maybe the book that for the most part focuses on Christian virtue should talk about joy. But I don't know, that may not be a very good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, why do you suspect that so little has been written on joy in our guild?
We're all asking unanswerable questions today.
And we know what the punishment is for that.
Well, you know, we would rather, if you mean by our guild, you mean like Christian ethicists or something like that, we would rather talk about conceptually what virtue is, the theory of virtue, than we would actually try to depict, talk about virtuous behavior, you know, what it would look like and feel like. And maybe, I mean, I don't necessarily say that critically, I mean, maybe that's what we're good at, and maybe you need novelists to try to really depict a kind of joy. There's in Tolstoy's War and Peace, there's a scene where Levin goes out to mow the grass, you know, with just these big long sides, I guess they were, with the serfs. And I mean, there's a lot going on. It's not clear whether the serfs really want him there, whether he's kind of just slumming, sort of, and so forth. But as the scene goes on, he is fully involved in the work, and it seems at a certain point it's no longer correct to call it work. There's a kind of joy in it. It's almost more like worship than work with that sort of joy. And it's a grand picture. I mean, that Tolstoy gives. It's a wonderful picture, though something that perhaps we experience infrequently, to be honest, but of that sort of thing. And it might take the skills of an artist, of a novelist, to really depict that. And those maybe aren't the skills we're given. Thanks. Excuse me.
I'm curious, in your work, if and what you've encountered about the role of community and communal praxis in the connection of virtue and joy, if that makes sense. There's a question about what is virtue, and it tends to be the virtuous person. But in my experience, it's when a community itself together tries to seek living in this world of vision that they care for together, that not only sustains that virtue, but I think a lot of that is where the joy finds itself as being a part of something. So I'm wondering if in your work you've encountered any thinkers, either on the theological or philosophical side, who've examined the role of living kind of in virtue together.
I don't know a lot to say about it with specific accent on joy, but more generally, I think that's pretty deep into virtue theory. For Aristotle, and I mean, there are certain subjects on which, eventually, if you're going to talk about them, you end up going back to Aristotle, and virtue is one of them. Ethics is a branch of politics. And Aristotle says that only the young man who's been well brought up can usefully study ethics. Only if the community has formed and trained his character in certain ways is he in a position really to study ethics. Quite different in the way we do it. Get freshmen in college and give them a set of hard cases with pro and con views, and we just confuse, every view sounds right to them, we just turn them all into relativists immediately. Their character is supposed to be well formed first. So politics is fundamental. The community has to form them, and I think that emphasis is pretty deep into thinking about virtue. Those I said, I'm not at the moment able to think of a particular connection with joy. If you think of the work of Stan Hauerwas, for instance, who's really been one of the people who has revived the language of virtue in Christian ethics, and I don't buy every move that Stanley makes, but certainly there's this very strong emphasis on community. One of his early books was called A Community of Character, for instance, and the claim was precisely that the kind of virtuous behavior that Christians are interested in, that the church is the place where it has to be developed. So I do think it's there. The problem that virtue theory has with that emphasis is that, at least for most of us in our world, we live in a number of communities intersecting and overlapping, and it's not quite clear. And they may inculcate different, they may form people in different ways, unfortunately, and therefore it's sort of not quite clear how to bring those together. And that's part of the difficulty figuring out what to do with virtue theory in our world. But I think, at least in its pure form, it agrees in exactly what you said, that community that forms us is as essential, and you can't really talk about virtue very usefully. It's just an individual matter.
Well, thank you for your lecture. So when you started talking about literature and community, oddly enough, Toni Morrison popped into my mind, particularly Beloved. And so the question I have, there's not an answer, I'd just like to hear how you think about this, is that it's set in the midst of a town which is largely composed of people who were runaway slaves, some who had been former slaves. And part of the town's existence was predicated on the duplicity of not recognizing nor publicly noticing, so that others wouldn't publicly notice, those who were technically owned by other people who were slaves. So what does virtue look like in the midst of a community that by necessity is built on a kind of duplicity and built on a kind of inauthenticity because it's rooted in the material need to not publicly recognize who is slave and who is free, because to do so would create a moral issue of whether or not that public notice would lead to someone being taken back into slavery. I mean, How much you think about something like that?
I said you were asking unanswerable questions, and you just sort of topping previous ones. Well, there are certainly people who have supposed that to be truly virtuous, at some point, we would just not be able to make our peace with evil, and that therefore duplicity and lying, even if in a good cause, Henry Sidgwick's utilitarianism would certainly prove it, even if in a good cause, would finally be destructive in some ways, and that we shouldn't do it because we just have to be confident that in the long run it's corrupting rather than leading to human flourishing. In certain circumstances, you have to really be confident about that claim in order to do it, in order not to engage in a certain kind of duplicity. I think of the, and I'm not really answering your question here, but I think of there's a passage in Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from prison. It's in the thing called piece called After 10 Years that he wrote for his co-conspirators. And I can't quote it exactly, but he says basically, when we Germans come out the other side of this, and we sort of can live in the light again, what good will we conspirators, be any longer? We who have had to turn ourselves into people who live by duplicity, will we be, he says something like, will we be of any use any longer? Doesn't answer the question. And of course he didn't live finally to personally try to answer it, but this is not a very satisfactory answer, but I guess my own answer would be that at a certain point that is a question that each person must answer for himself or herself. In other words, am I at the point where I would be embracing evil as if it were my own good if I were to continue to cooperate in whatever religious duplicity. I don't know that there's a formula that I've got for answering that question. I do think there'd be a point at which any given individual might have to say, I can't any longer do this, whatever the consequences. But I wouldn't be too quick to tell somebody else that they'd arrived at that point. That's what I think is true.
Yeah, well, thanks once again for coming up to the other I state. The
corrupt one.
I don't have a dog in that fight. All right. So I want to thank you once again.